Okay, so I have ambitious. I have a lot of ambitions for today. That I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to cover everything that I want to. Essentially, what I want to do today is give you an overview of attachment theory, and then talk about two models of dyadic/family therapy that are based on attachment theory. Really, so I really need like 2 hours for the introduction to attachment theory, 2 hours, and then 2 hours for each model to give you an introduction to EFT and CPP. So we're going to try to cram 6 hours into 2 today. Now, in order to do that, again, like the first time I spoke here, what I'm going to ask is to hold questions until I pause. I'll pause and ask for questions, but because there's just a ton of material to get to, I'm not going to take questions as we go along. Okay, attachment theory is exciting, because attachment theory is really the cutting edge of relational theories. And attachment theory is fairly new to the scene of family therapy. Family therapy was developed by a bunch of theorists and individuals who, for the most part, rejected psychoanalysis and really sort of the intrapsychic explanations of psychology, for the most part. It was really only in the 80s and 90s that family therapists began to become interested in not just the interpersonal nature of the family, but what goes on intrapsychically as well. So attachment theory, along with narrative therapy, is sort of one of the two sort of new trends in family therapy, and it's really it's had a pervasive influence on all different theories. Now, where we're going to start is with the foundations of attachment theory. I really want to give a good introduction of what attachment theory is and what it isn't, so that when we move into the family theory, we'll sort of get an understanding of how attachment theory has influenced the field and how it influences different models. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so. Attachment theory emerges from the field of psychoanalysis. And I'm going to go through this very, very quickly, but it's important to understand exactly where attachment theory comes from. Classic psychoanalysis discounts the relational aspect of experience, right? Personality, from a classic psychoanalytic perspective, comes from the theory of, it is based on the theory of drive. It is a biological theory. Freud really discounted the influence of early relationships on personality, which is a misnomer. Most people associate Freud with the idea of bad mothering and the influence that ensues from that. But in actuality, that wasn't what Freud said. Freud, for the most part, discounted the early experience and felt that it only had a minor influence on the development of personality and psychopathology. The emphasis was on unconscious drive, was on the structures of the self, and clinically, where that became very relevant was in the work with children. And this is where the originator of attachment theory, John Bowlby, comes into the picture. This is John Bowlby, and I imagine not the greatest picture of him. Now, Bowlby grew up in England and was trained as a psychiatrist. And like most people at the time interested in mental health, gets trained in psychoanalysis. And one of his supervisors, his primary supervisor, is actually Melanie Klein, who was one of the originators of work with children in psychoanalysis. Now, Bowlby has a number of different experiences which convinces him in a very strong and powerful way that the model that psychoanalysis was using at the time of drive and of dismissing the actual relationships between mother and child, or between caregivers and child, was all wrong. He has lots of experiences in orphanages and in homes for troubled children, where he begins to recognize that it's separation and traumatic experience early in life that is really at the core of the psychopathology that he's seeing. Now, he speaks about this with Klein, and they actually have a famous case that he talks about where he's working with a 6-year-old boy who has a really troubled relationship with his mother, and he tells Klein in supervision that he wants to meet with the mother, which seems like, again, from a contemporary ear, that seems to be a very reasonable proposition. Klein rejects that totally out of hand. And her contention is that meeting with the mother is going to interfere with the transference that's developing in the individual therapy with the child. And again, that was the classic psychoanalytic position at the time. Bowlby begins to, in response to this, Bowlby begins to leave the classic model of psychoanalysis, and he begins to associate with what was called in England at the time the independent school of psychoanalysis. These became sort of the founders of the object relations movement. But even then, he begins to propose theories that psychoanalysts find to be too controversial, and eventually he really moves away from psychoanalysis. Now, so what we're going to do for the first couple of minutes is talk about Bowlby and where he comes from. Now, Bowlby was very interested in understanding how the hard sciences and the sciences and the social sciences outside of psychology could influence our understanding of human personality. And specifically, he was interested in the field of ethology, which is basically the study of animal behavior. He studies the work of two people, one named Konrad Lorenz, the other named Harry Harlow, who were doing at the time some really important research. Konrad Lorenz at the time was doing research on imprinting. So if you see, this is Lorenz. This is the duck guy. If you ever heard, this is the guy who realized that if he could expose himself to ducklings when they hatch before the mother, that they would follow him as opposed to the mother. Harlow was doing work with rhesus macaques, with monkeys. This is also very, very famous research, which you may have heard of. This was the famous study where Harlow built two. Essentially, what was happening. Harlow was a research psychologist. He was studying cognitions in monkeys, trying to glean from that some ideas about human cognition. And actually, what he found—it's a funny story. What he found was that what they would do is they would separate the baby monkeys from their mothers and put them in cages. And the problem is that half of the monkeys would die, before they reached adulthood. What he realized, so one time he was walking through his lab, and the cleaner had left a rag in one of the cages of the baby monkeys, and he saw the baby monkey clutching the rag. And he thought, like a good researcher does, he thought, oh, this is interesting, let's think about this. And he devised a series of experiments, the most famous one being where he rigged sort of two mothers in the cages of the baby monkeys. One was a wire mother, sort of a bunch of wires made to look like a monkey, which had a bottle on it, so the monkey could get fed by this wire mother. And the other mother was a cloth mother, basically the same wire contraption, just with cloth placed over it, but no bottle. And what he found was that the monkeys preferred the mother with the cloth as opposed to the mother with the feeding. Now again, this was in Harlow's mind, and when Bowlby reads this research, it confirms his suspicions that Freud was all wrong. Again, from Freud's perspective, love develops out of drive fulfillment, out of the fact that the mother feeds the child. All these emotional feelings are enacted. This research sort of proves in a very, very clear way that this is not the case. That there's something that goes beyond the actual feeding that is formative in the development of the connection with the mother. So what he recognizes is that drives are not at the core of experience. So they're not at the core of personality and what drives us interpersonally. So the question is, what is? Now, what Bowlby begins to develop a model, which he asks himself a very basic question. And what he says to himself is essentially this. If I think of a child who is completely vulnerable and can't take care of themselves, if there's a mechanism, how do children then survive, right? How do we ensure that a child doesn't get eaten by a lion or run over by a car? Right, we have caregivers to take care of them. They ensure the survival and the safety of their vulnerable children. And what Bowlby begins to propose is a very logical and reasonable assumption. What he says is that if there's a mechanism, an emotional mechanism inside of a child that will ensure the maintenance of proximity between the child and the mother, that child will have a greater chance of survival. And so, this formulation is at the core of attachment theory. At the core of attachment theory is the idea of safety. The attachment system is a system that ensures the survival. It's a system designed to ensure the survival of vulnerable children by creating a need and an impulse for them to attach to their caregivers. It's an automatic, or in Bowlby's words, a cybernetic system. It happens automatically. When children feel separation, they will feel the need to maintain proximity. So one way to think about this, the example that I always give, is to think about a park. Right? So if you think about a park, what happens? So the parents come to the park with their, whatever, toddlers or young children, and the mother or the father sits on the bench, and the child begins to run around. What happens is that the child will always be cognizant of their caregiver, and they will maintain a certain level of proximity. And not only that, when they try something new, so let's say the child is, climbing the monkey bars for the first time, or going up a slide that is higher than the child has ever done before, the child will check in with the caregiver in order to sort of refill that feeling of safety, and then they'll proceed to explore or to challenge themselves. But again, Bowlby's basic formulation is that connection is formed based on a need for children to maintain proximity to their caregivers, because that's what keeps them safe. Now, based on that, the two emotions that are going to be formative here and that are going to be most important are fear and safety, or fear and security. And if you'll see, what I'm emphasizing the word feelings here, because feelings are the engine that makes the attachment system run. When children feel a sense of fear, the attachment system will be activated. When they feel security, they will then go and explore. But the basic the basic thrust of this is that children have an inherent need to be connected to their caregivers, not based on feeding, not based on the fulfillment of drives, just based on the fact that these are the people that care for them. And the maintenance of security is the fulcrum, is the engine that drives this system. Oh, sorry. Now, Bowlby had a number of students. The most prominent one was named Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth began working with Bowlby already when he was in England, and she becomes very convinced that he's onto something. Now, she moves to Uganda in the late 50s with her husband, who takes on a research position there. And while she's there, she organizes a study of Ugandan mothers, where she observes them with their children. She notices a couple of things. Number one, she notices, along the lines of what Bowlby is saying, is a natural inclination for children to maintain proximity with their caregivers, with their mothers. When children are separated from their mothers, they automatically seek to achieve proximity to them. They automatically seek them out and go back to them. Now, the other thing she begins to observe is that there are differences in the way that this is working. There are certain babies where that attachment system flows automatically, and there are certain babies where that's problematic. And that's really all she gets to in this study. But she begins to think that the attachment system is not a static instrument. It's not a static system. That there are deviations and differences in how attachment is achieved and how it's actually enacted. Now, Ainsworth goes back to her hometown of Baltimore, and she organizes another study where she has research assistants go into the homes of mothers and observe them, and take copious notes of the interactions between the mother and the child. And again, differences are noted in the way the mothers are relating to their children, and then the way the children are relating to their mothers. And specifically what she finds is that the mothers who actually put in the most time, who at the time do what might have been termed as spoiling their children, are very tuned into them and are connected to what's going on. Their children, when during follow-ups when they're 1 and 1.5 years old, these children are the ones that are actually the most independent. As a second part of this study, she devises what's called the strange situation, which again is perhaps the most famous and well-known psychological study that actually exists. The strange situation consists of 8 parts. I'm not going to get into exactly how the research is done, but it consists of 8 parts where the mother comes in, the mother and the child are together. The mother leaves. A researcher comes in. What Ainsworth was looking for is the behavior of the child upon departure, and more importantly, upon reunion. What happened to the child when the mother came back into the room after a separation? Now, this actually the research wasn't designed to elicit categories of attachment. She was really just trying to prove Bowlby's basic theory that attachment existed. But what she ended up finding was that there was 3 distinct ways that children responded to separation and reunion. In the majority of children, when the mother left, were very, very upset. Eventually they calmed down, and when the mother returned, they were excited to see her, and the mothers returned regulated them to the point where they were calm. And there was a joyful reunion upon the mother's return. And this she called secure attachment. The second category was where there was a small subsection of children, around 10 to 12%, a little bit less than that actually, who didn't show any emotion when the mother left, or showed minimal emotion when the mother left. In other words, they weren't distraught or upset when the mother left. And upon return, they sort of disregarded the mother. It wasn't really like a big deal. They didn't go back for a joyful reunion. And these she called avoided children. The third category were children who were just absolutely distraught when the mother left. And upon reunion, and here's the key, upon reunion they ran back to the mother, but the mother's return didn't calm them down. They kept upping the ante of their emotional expression. There wasn't the sinking in that Ainsworth observed with secure children. That sinking in where the mother holds the child, and the child sort of like the body relaxes and sort of just sinks into the mother. Those are the 3 categories that Ainsworth identified. Now, subsequently, a researcher named Mary Main identified a 4th category, which she called disorganized attachment. And these were children, a very small subsection of children, who exhibited really, really bizarre behavior upon the mother's return. They would both approach and withdraw. They would sort of get up to go back to the mother, and then fall and collapse in a heap. What Main understood was that these were upon further research, what was discovered with these children was that these were children who were recipients of some type of severe abuse or neglect. And we'll get into how all of these categories can be understood as attachment strategies. As we move forward, we're going to understand how these are strategies of attachment, and how their responses to the interpersonal and the interactions between the mother and the child. Now, if we move back to Bowlby for a second, Bowlby beyond the attachment system, Bowlby proposed what he called the internal working model. His thought here was that the nature of attachment will influence the personality development of the child. It will develop what he calls a working model, a representation of self and other. Based on the early experiences of the child, between the child and the mother, the child will come to understand how the world will respond and develop an idea about him or herself based on those expectations. So now, how does this work? So what Bowlby proposed is that parental interest and responsiveness leads to a general sense of acceptability. I am acceptable. Now again, initially, this is not a verbal, this is a pre-verbal sense. It's represented sort of beyond words. But as language is developed, this becomes their thought patterns begin to develop along the lines of acceptability or a lack of acceptability. But when there is parental interest, the child will gain a broad sense of the idea that I am acceptable, that's the representation of self, that's the working model of self, acceptability and goodness, which will then lead to an expectation and an understanding of how people relate to them. That's the representation of other, that's the working model of other. Right? So I'm acceptable, and therefore because people value me. Because I'm acceptable and I'm basically good, people value me. And when you have an expectation that people will value you, you will relate to them with secure attachment strategies. The child will feel comfortable relating all of their emotional experience to others. There will be no need to restrict or to amplify emotional experience in order to elicit responses. Right? The environment responds to who I am because I am acceptable and they value me. On the other hand, when there are disturbances in early attachment, the opposite will take place. When there is disinterest, neglect, or maltreatment, so the child will internalize a sense of I am unacceptable or I am not good, which again will lead to this sense of people don't value me, right? If I am not good, if I am not acceptable, then why would people value me or take interest in me or want to be around me or care about what I think or feel or accept those feelings? Which will lead to insecure attachment strategies. Right? I need to adapt my behavior in order to elicit responses, in order to fit into the social milieu. So now if we go back to our attachment categories, we can within the internal working model, we can understand if we go back to the attachment categories, we can understand along the lines of the internal working model how these are actually attachment strategies. So I'll go back there for a second. If we think about secure attachment, these are children who have developed a sense, my caregivers are going to be responsive to me. And so therefore, upon return, they know that when I go back for a hug or a kiss, my mother is going to be accepting of that. She's going to want to give that to me, and I can go back to my mother to feel calmed. On the other hand, avoided children were found to be children where there was some level of neglect or disinterest or lack of attunement. And the basic idea, and the strategy there is that the child recognizes that no matter what I do, nothing's really going to happen, so I might as well mute my response. If I amplify my response, if I try to elicit care, it's just going to be more hurtful because I'm not going to get it. With ambivalent attachment, the child, these are typically children of parents who have difficulty regulating themselves. And the child always feels the need to amplify their response in order to elicit that care. If I only show a little bit more, then I'll get regulated. I'll get the care that I need. And finally, with disorganized attachment, these are children for whom the attachment the parent is both a source of safety and a source of fear. Remember, with disorganized attachment, these were children who were found to be in relationships that were full of either abuse or neglect. And so the parent becomes a source of fear, and the child is put in an untenable dilemma. There's a separation, and so I feel fear. The mother returns, and the mother naturally is an attachment figure, and so I go back to the mother in order to get calmed down, but at the same time, going back to the mother elicits fear in me because the mother is also a trigger of insecurity and fear. So, and that's the explanation for the really bizarre behaviors that were seen in the strange situation of approach and avoidance at the same time. Now, the next step that we'll talk about is that for the first sort of 20 years of attachment research, the research tended to focus on children. Now, what the internal working model that Bowlby proposed would say is that these early relationships are instructive in understanding how personality develops. Now, again, I want to add something here. When we talk about a secure or an insecure relationship, we're talking about the security of that relationship specifically. So what research has shown very, very clearly is that a child could have different types of categories with different caregivers. A child could be secure with their mother and insecure with their father, or vice versa. The strange situation doesn't measure the nature of attachment in the child. It just measures the nature of the attachment in that specific relationship that's being tested. But what Bowlby would say is that if there's a preponderance of one type of relationship, then that will create an internal working model that will inform the personality development of the child moving through the lifespan. Now, so this went untested for a while until another attachment researcher named Mary Main came along. And what she proposed was that the best way to test for adult attachment is through the adults' narratives of their childhood. Right? What she felt was that the narratives, the way they tell their story, will tell us about how they feel about their own attachments growing up, and more than that, where they are now in terms of their own internal working models. And so she devised what's called another formative research tool in attachment theory, the adult attachment interview. And the adult attachment interview is essentially a list of questions, of open-ended questions about adults' childhood experiences and experiences with their caregivers. And what the researchers are looking for is not necessarily the content of what is spoken about. What they're actually looking for is the process in which that is related. And again, Main found 4 different types of attachment styles based on the adult attachment interview. So in the first style is what she called autonomous, where the narratives of the adults were related linearly and clearly. Right? The adults were able to tell a very, very sort of clear, straightforward, and organized story about their childhood in a way that wasn't devoid of emotion. That was where emotions were elicited. They could talk about the emotional content. They could talk about how they felt. There was affect in their expressions, but that affect didn't overwhelm them so as to interfere with the basic coherence of their story. The second type of adult attachment that she found was what she called insecure dismissive. Now, these were adults who related the story of their childhood in a very, very simplistic way. Either it was done in a way that was overly like idealistic, or what's the word I'm looking for? It shown like they presented their childhoods in a way that was very, very rosy. My childhood was great. It was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. Things were good, and everything was fairly, it was okay. Or they were somewhat dismissive. They said, I don't really remember much of my childhood. It's not that, I don't think childhood's that important. It doesn't really influence who I am right now. That she labeled the dismissive form of adult attachment. And the third was preoccupied, where the narratives were fairly disorganized, difficult to follow, jumping between time periods, and overwhelmed with emotion. And finally, the fourth adult attachment style was the insecure and unresolved. And there, what she found was that when traumatic experiences were being related in the interview, the interview lacked any sense of coherence. There would be dissociation, or the person being interviewed would talk in ways that made no sense. They would talk about people who were dead as if that they were currently living. Or they would they would give people powers that no human being can have. And this again was called insecure, unresolved. Now, what Maine found over the course of a number of different, I'm going to take questions in a minute. What Maine found over the course of further research was connections between the two categories. Number one, that autonomous parents tended to produce secure kids. Dismissive parents produced avoidant kids, and so on. And that secure children tended to grow, when longitudinal research was done on this, that children who were secure at the age of 1 tended to also be secure at the age of 6, and then also tended to be autonomous at the age, when they were grown up. And the same for avoidant and ambivalent and disorganized. So now again, this it's not destiny. There wasn't a 100% correlation here, but overwhelmingly this was the case. What this really was a confirmation of the internal working model. Right. Based on this research, Maine was able to recognize that Bowlby was onto something with the internal that was onto something when he asserted that early experiences are formative in developing these attachment styles, and that those are of crucial importance in terms of the development of personality and also psychopathology. Okay, I'll pause here for questions. We're going to get into some current trends in it. So basically what I've spoken about now is sort of like the ABCs of attachment theory. These are the nuts and bolts. We're going to move into, in a minute, we're going to move into some current trends, but I'll pause here for questions. I thought there was a question over here. Okay. The question was, with adult attachment, can I provide an example, sort of beyond the theory? Sure. So, in practice, in clinical practice, what you'll often get, if we talk about sort of on the dismissive spectrum, what you'll often get is when you talk to somebody about their early experiences, they will say, yeah, it doesn't really, it's really not so important. Now, these are typically people who have more difficulty getting in touch with their own emotions, who are more, have trouble with intimate relationships, who find themselves not able to formulate close relationships because they can't engender any intimacy. Preoccupied adults are typically the ones who come in with lots of anxiety. They can't regulate themselves. They might feel depression is an interesting one. Sometimes you get depression on the avoidance spectrum, where people just feel empty. When people talk about feeling empty, usually that's a sign that there's something dismissive. On the other hand, depression may be a feeling of just feeling completely overwhelmed with life and not being able to manage it. This is where depression usually overlaps with anxiety. But those types of people, when people have difficulties with regulation, that's usually an indication of somebody being located along the lines of the preoccupied spectrum. And disorganized / unresolved attachment in adults, this is usually where we find access to presentations. So, personality disorders, either borderline personality or complex PTSD. Again, these are usually where there has been severe trauma in the background, and there's essentially no capacity there is minimal capacity to regulate themselves. These are where relationships are so triggering because there is this massive need for relationships because people feel difficulty regulating by themselves. On the other hand, relationships are extremely, extremely scary. This is where, when we talk about splitting, this is one way of understanding splitting. On one hand, relationships are so necessary because there's very, very little capacity to regulate independently. On the other hand, and so there's this massive need to form relationships. And yet on the other hand, those relationships are extraordinarily scary and frightening, and they trigger trauma responses. Yeah.
So I'm just going back to the foundation of the Bowlby part. Is the research show that it's really the child is looking for proximity, or is it actual physical touch? Because with the monkeys there was the cloth, and there's also the research that showed the babies that died because they weren't housed.
Okay. The question was whether the issue is proximity or whether it's more sort of they're looking for an emotional connection, physical touch. Hold off on that. When we get to current trends, we're gonna get there. Any other questions before we move on?
So when you trace the adults categories back to childhood, is it necessarily a valid reflection of how the parents relate to the child, or could you see like a problem in that child who's now an adult's ability to attach to the parent? Is it necessarily one direction?
Okay. The question is whether this is one directional or it's multi-directional. Whether there is whether it's just the parents. Is this to totally blame parents, or are we gonna introduce some complexity here? So it's a great question. I appreciate you bringing this up. Yes. What's important here is it's unclear to the extent to which the early attachment researchers felt that, sort of what they felt on the nature-nurture debate, but it's really not a debate anymore. What we're really talking about here is fit. There's lots of temperament research that shows that there are certain children who have more difficulty forming attachments, and then there are certain children who come in with a temperament that doesn't fit their parents' temperament, and that can create disturbances in the attachment system also. So again, what we're talking about when we draw parallels between adult attachment and child attachment, we're sort of talking about overarching categories, but there's certainly much more complexity within each style. Okay, so I'm going to move on. We're going to talk about current trends now. I can't spend as long as I want to on this, but there's a couple of things here. Where current research has focused, as was brought up a second ago, on moving the field of attachment beyond just the basic idea of proximity. Proximity is still the goal in the sense that is what the attachment system is based on. Right? The reason the system is there is in order to ensure survival, but it goes well beyond that. Because what is the engine that makes the attachment system run? It is feelings. Now, what happens here, and this is what researchers have begun to identify, is that attachment theory is really a theory of regulation. So there's one of the famous attachment researchers who was also a leader in the field of neurobiology is Alan Shore. He's begun to call attachment theory regulation theory for this reason, because what is happening in the attachment system? When the child feels a sense of fear or anguish or some type of vulnerability, that is an inherently dysregulating feeling, right? That we don't feel in control when we're feeling those vulnerable feelings. What happens is the child goes back to the caregiver, and the caregiver has the capacity to regulate those feelings. Going back to the caregiver has the impact of lowering the intensity of the emotion and bringing a child back to a feeling of security. So the reason we could talk about multiple levels of understanding of what's happening in attachment. On sort of the deepest level, what's really happening is that the child is maintaining proximity to the caregiver in order to remain safe. That's not the actual experience of the child. Right? The child is not thinking, oh, you know what, I'm unsafe now, I'm going to go back to mom and mom's going to protect me. What the child is feeling is, I feel terrible. When I go back to mom or when I go back to dad, I'm going to feel better. Mom or dad has the capacity to lower the dysregulation that I'm feeling and bring me back to a feeling of equilibrium and calm. And there are multiple ways to do that, right? Touch is an important one. Right. So now again, so we're not talking about psychoanalysis, but this was the idea of Donald Winnicott, is that there are, when he talks about the transitional objects, is that as children move away from their caregivers, they need something. They sort of need like an in between, an object that sort of facilitates this in between space. That's a whole other lecture in and of itself. But what facilitates, so now once we talk about regulation as being the key and the fundamental piece of attachment, this brings us to some important recognitions. Number one, the way that attachment is formulated is based on what we now call attunement. To the extent that parents are attuned to their children, that they can tune in to the emotional valence, that they can tune into what is going on for the child emotionally and mirror that, that is what regulates the child. And so attachment researchers are looking at sort of the moment-to-moment, very, very sort of discrete and basic interactions that are going on between child and caregiver. Eye contact, comfort. I can look at this. So this is a picture of me and my dad. So this is what attachment researchers are looking at, right? This is the parent's ability to tune in completely to the experience of the child. When the child feels tuned into, that is what is common. Another word that researchers use is contingent, right? That the response of the parent needs to be contingent. There's a story. The last time I spoke here, I told this story. But it's a great story to illustrate this. So when we first moved to Israel, we lived in Nachlaot, and we used to go to the park in Shari Chesed, the park in Rechavia. If anybody knows this park, it's the worst park in all of the world, probably. It's designed so children can get hurt, I'm convinced. Basically, we can have a whole lecture on the problems with this park. But the most fundamental problem with the park is that you have these swings that are I see people nodding. There are these swings that are in a circle and swing out into the path where the children are walking back and forth. And these are not plastic swings; these are iron swings. So at least a couple of times a day, you'll see a child get smacked in the head with one of these iron swings. Now, so I was taking my eldest son to the party, whatever, I forget how old he was at the time, and I'm watching him, and I see, again, inevitably, a child running down, and the swing swings back and smacks him in the face, and understandably he's distraught. Now, who knows what Israelis say when their child gets hurt? The biggest one is לא קרה כלום. לא קרה כלום. Right. Okay, but the child is crying and crying. The mother comes and she says לא קרה כלום. And again, I'm a new oled. לא קרה כלום. Like something happened here, right? It seemed to me the most bizarre statement that one could possibly imagine. But you know what? The child calmed down. And the reason the child calmed down is because the verbal expression was actually not all that important. What the mother was doing in that moment was connecting to the child's experience. So the nonverbals sort of overwhelmed the ridiculousness of that statement. And because the child felt, that was what calmed the child down. That was what enabled that regulation. Before we get to the three components, before we get to the summarizing. What current attachment theory is focused on is the way in which parents can connect and stay attuned to their child. There's also neuroscience plays a big role in current attachment theory, because what we found is that when this attunement process is taking place, there are major changes in the body, and specifically major changes in the brain. The secure brain looks very different than the avoidant or the ambivalent brain. And this is really the big push in attachment research right now is connecting attachment styles and attachment theory broadly to our growing understanding of neuroscience. Now, the other very interesting trend in attachment research is cross-cultural attachment. And specifically, the extent to which our understanding of attachment theory has validity across cultures. This idea of sensitivity and attunement, there is growing research coming mostly from anthropology that this is not a universal construct. That while the attachment system exists across cultures, the way in which that system is run, sort of the motor behind that system, is different based on culture. Again, that's another whole lecture that I'm not going to get into. That's another sort of growing field of research. And when we work cross-culturally, it's an important thing to keep in mind, not to make assumptions about what, quote-unquote good parenting is. We have to understand what good parenting is from the perspective of specific cultures. Okay, I'm going to summarize attachment, and then we're going to move into family therapy. So attachment is composed of three components. Or one way of thinking about this is when attachment is working securely and smoothly, we should be seeing three things. The first thing that we should be seeing is tracking. So the child should be attuned and the child should be tracking the whereabouts of their caregiver. We shouldn't see a child who is completely oblivious to their caregiver's whereabouts. Children should notice exactly where the parents are. If we go back to our example of the park, when the child is going off on their own on the monkey bars or on the swings or on the slides, so periodically what you'll see is the child checking in with their parents. They're looking back to the bench, ensuring that the parent is still there. Right? Children will typically this will be amplified in times of where they're exploring, where they're doing something new. So they might go, if they're going on the monkey bars, like I mentioned before, if they're going on the monkey bars for the first time, they might go back to the parent and say, "Look, Mom, I'm going on the monkey bars," or just look back, make eye contact, and get an approving nod. That reinstills that feeling of security, which allows them to move on to the second piece, which is the secure base. Right? That what I just described right now, that checking in, the tuning into the parents, gives that sort of that refill of security that is needed to explore. So exploration, healthy exploration, will be enabled when children feel connected to a secure base. When children feel confidence in their attachments, or in their specific attachment to a caregiver, they will then be able to explore. Now, we could think about this on the level of the toddler in the park. We could also think about this on the level of a latency age child, and we could think about this on the level of an adolescent. The only difference here is the attachment needs and and what we define as exploration. So, for a teenager who is nervous about driving, I don't know how many teenagers are nervous about driving, but let's say a teenager is nervous about driving. So the teenager what attachment might look like is a discussion or a conversation with their parents talking about driving. Or with teenagers, they might look to their friends as attachment figures, right? The attachment figures that are created in adolescence may expand, and so they'll have a conversation with friends about driving, and that might look differently. What security will be might look differently between boys and girls. During latency, a child who is feeling very anxious about a gymnastics performance or a baseball game will feel might need their parents on the sidelines watching them. And before they get up to bat, they'll take a look over at their parents and get a nod, and then that will give them the confidence to get up to bat or to perform that recital. But the basic idea, and in adulthood, one spouse is interviewing for a job that is really important, and they feel very, very nervous. Again, fear. and they go back to they go to their spouse and get a peck on the cheek and say, you know, I know you can do it, and that will be that refill of security that allows them to explore, in this context, to take the challenge of going for that job that they really want. And finally, the third piece of attachment that we're looking for is a seamless return to the caregiver. Because no matter what, in exploration, there are going to be times where things go wrong. And what we want to see in a secure attachment is the ability for the child to return to the caregiver when those things have gone wrong. When there is fear or when there is vulnerability, we want the child to be able to seamlessly go back to the caregiver in order to get that reassurance, in order to get regulated. So these are the three components of the attachment system. I'll say one more thing about this. What we know about the return to the caregiver is especially important when we think about family therapy, because this is going to be when we have disturbances in family relationships. These are what we're actually talking about, are attachment disturbances, and we want to be able to see that children that family members can reunite in an experience that is mutually regulated. What happens when there is a disturbance in attachment, or when there's a fear-inducing stimulus, is you have this anxiety-inducing stimulus, which activates the sympathetic nervous system, right? So we might call this fight or flight, right? where the child, if we're talking about a classic attachment system, a classic attachment relationship between a parent and a child, you'll have the child will begin to feel very, very anxious based on that anxiety-inducing stimulus. There will be physiological processes that will induce that fight or flight response. Now that is dysregulating. That is dysregulating. It is necessary in the moment, but it doesn't feel good long term. The sympathetic nervous system reaction will create an increase in cortisol. That's the hormone that induces the fight or flight. Now again, in this state, there are all types of ramifications, but at the very, very basic level, it just doesn't feel good. This is a very, very anxiety-inducing. It is an uncomfortable place to be. What the return to the caregiver actually does, when there is a reunion, that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which lowers cortisol. So when the child goes back to get a kiss, right? So the child gets hurt, right, or gets a boo-boo, and goes back to mom or goes back to dad and gets a kiss, and mom and dad says, feel it all better. Now, actually, it is all better. It's not just in the mind. There is a process which actually makes the boo-boo feel less painful, right? Because this process of the reunion, of the return to the caregiver, lowers the overall anxiety and activation level of the body. The children can actually feel calmer and feel more secure. Okay. Now, before I go, we're going to go into how this is applied to family theory, and we're going to spend the next hour doing that. But again, I'll pause for questions here to talk about any of the current trends in attachment theory.
Just had a question. I've been reading about this recently, and I read a lot about how researchers are trying to understand how it affects how people relate when they're adults to other people. Mm-hmm. Is that pretty much closed now? Is that not being worked on, or is that still like a current trend?
The question is, in terms of the research now, is how early attachment impacts later relationships. Is that still being worked on? Yeah, it is still being worked on. It's no longer a controversial statement anymore to say that early attachment patterns are inform in a very, very strong way later attachment patterns. But there's lots of research going on that goes into the nuances of that. So, for example, one source of research right now is the concept of earned attachment, where you have a subsection of people, like I mentioned before. If you look at these categories, there's a strong correlation between early attachment categories and later attachment categories, but that's not perfect. So you will have some people who who had insecure attachment growing up, who are autonomous adults, who are secure and autonomous adults, and that's what we call earned attachment. What the research has found is for people who have spent a long time thinking and connecting with their past and making sense of it, that is usually what leads to earned attachment. So if we think about that, this is often what we do in psychotherapy. This is what leads to earned attachment. Another current trend is understanding how attachment relates to specific psychopathologies. So, for example, there's a lot of research now going on that connects attachment to substance abuse and addiction, and really understanding how early attachment leads to. Again, what the research shows, again, very, very clearly, is that addiction is highly correlated with insecure attachments, and understanding why that is a source of research right now. So again, the research is not necessarily focused on like the basic assertion of the connection between early attachment and later attachment. It's sort of going into the nuances of that.
How about research within Israel, let's say Moroccan community, Ethiopian community, because the parenting seems to be very different, and working with these families seems to be very different.
Okay, the question is, for example, in Israel, thinking about attachment and working with specific communities. It's a great question. It's what my dissertation is on. Sorry? The cultural piece, yeah. So I'm actually part of a research team in Hebrew U, that is working on this specifically in Israel, working with a number of different communities, trying to understand specific sort of cultural nuances of attachment. Specifically, most specifically, whether the basic. There's a number of important questions. Number one, to what extent is sensitivity a crucial factor? So I'm doing research right now in the Haredi community. And thinking about, number one, how large families influence attachment, because attachment research was essentially all done in a Western context with two parents and a child or two, and how does having 11 kids influence attachment? So there's research. There's lots of research going on there, specifically in Israel. There's a group in Israel. That formulated something that's called the universality hypothesis, which is the hypothesis which takes the position that while there may be small nuances, attachment theory is really a universal construct. That's not so. Based on the research that's coming out right now, that's not altogether clear. So when I finish my dissertation, I'll come back here and tell you all about it. Any other questions about the basics of attachment, the basic theory, before we move on to how we apply it to families? Okay, great. Now,
I wasn't sure if it comes in, but we're talking about religious communities. Sometimes I can see people who have had very bad attachment and they do have the religious piece of connecting to God as an attachment. Is that coming in anywhere? Like I say, where does that come in?
the question is on working with religious communities where there is ostensibly insecure attachment in childhood, but somehow in the relationship to God, that seems to facilitate security. Did I get your question right?
Yeah.
So that's another. There's a lot being written on that right now. You actually, I had two plans here because I actually published a paper on not on. It was coming from the perspective of self-psychology, but so there's a lot of overlaps with attachment. The question of can the relationship to God can that be a secure attachment? Can that facilitate security? It's really a question that again, I don't want to get too deep into this, but the issue or the problem or the issue with the relationship to God is that the relationship to God is whatever we want it to be, essentially. In other words, my representation to God can be, I can think of him in whatever way I want to, because I'm not a nothing. And I have no direct interaction. I have no sort of direct verbal face-to-face interaction with God. And so I can sort of formulate it in lots of different ways. And what that can often do is just facilitate the attachment patterns that I already have. So what you'll find, what research has shown, this was done less in attachment, more in psychoanalysis, is that the representations, the way we think about God, are often very, very similar to our early attachment experiences. So if we're in attachment experiences that are really oppressive, or really, let's use our attachment styles. If I grew up with an insecure attachment strategy, so I'm more likely to think about God in a way of like, he doesn't really care about me. I'm insignificant. And we could run down all the different attachment styles. What I found clinical, I haven't seen research on this, but what I propose in the article that I wrote is that when people can really can change the representations of God and sort of go beyond what they themselves have experienced as children and formulate a different attachment experience, that is what is actually could produce more security. And that's. Sorry?
We say on the other neuron, ink burning, in other words.
Okay, yeah, right. So there are those two aspects, and to what extent can we merge the different aspects, the different relationships the different types of relationships that are possible with God, and that is what clinically, again, I can't say this based on research, but clinically that is what I found to be useful and to promote growth. Okay. That had nothing to do with attachment theory, but it's really interesting. Excuse me, it had nothing to do with family therapy, but it was really, really interesting.
I have one question.
Please.
If you're not attached, okay, I'll use that term, the nervous system is affected, I'm wondering also how and if that affects the health, physical, because kind of if you're always like a hyper alert state,
Yep.
what does that mean? Does that cause, I don't know if you know, but high blood pressure, diabetes, that's different.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is when there is when there is overwhelmingly insecure attachment, and as a result of that, there is difficulty regulating, and you're sort of in the state of hypervigilance. What is the impact on the body? And the impact on the body is not good. When you exist in a state of hypervigilance, what we're essentially talking about on a physiological level is that you have stress hormones coursing through the body at all times. So there's a attachment theorist a neuroscientist named Louis Cazalino, who wrote a book called Neuroscience, certain neuroscience and therapy, something like that. But what he likens it to is that the stress responses of the body are like burning furniture in the winter, which I think is a really nice metaphor. In other words, it produces in the moment. It's important. If you have no heat in the winter, you might need to burn your furniture to get warm. But then you're left with no furniture. Then your house is destroyed. It's the same thing with the body. When you need an elevation of cortisol and other stress hormones in moments of panic and danger, right? That is what allows the body to respond to those experiences. But they have a corrosive effect on the body itself. Now, that sort of goes beyond my expertise, what specifically the corrosive effects are. But we, again, even intuitively, we can imagine, like you said, a state of hyperarousal will almost inevitably lead to just ongoing anxiety, especially when our internal working models don't allow us to regulate that with close relationships. Okay, I'll take one more question, then we'll move on.
Curious about siblings, like it comes back to previous questions as well, just like if the same parents
Yep.
group of them.
Right, so the question is about sibling attachment.
Sorry, that's not my question.
No, it's not your question.
About siblings attaching to each other,
Yeah.
about the same parents parenting children and like,
Different
the same
siblings.
parenting style.
Yeah. Okay, the question was about how it manifests with different siblings within the same. So there you're going to see differences you will see differences in siblings' attachment styles, and that's attributed to two things. Number one, we talked about, a couple minutes ago, we talked about temperament. So temperament is, each child is born with a different temperament. And partially based on that, and this goes to the other piece, is that parents have different relationships with each child. And so remember, that we can't think about the attachment categories as sort of overarching and all-encompassing categories. They are definitions of the nature of specific relationships. So it's possible for a parent to have a secure relationship with one child and an insecure, avoidant, or an insecure, ambivalent attachment with another child. And that's going to lead to differences in each child's internal working model. This is going to be very, very relevant when we talk about family therapy, because inevitably different children's presentations are going to elicit different ways of relating on the part of the parent. And that is going to form an internal working model that recreates specific attachment patterns, right? And here we go back to, well, this is a good segue. Let's go into family therapy now. So the early family therapists were focused on, they had an important insight, which, as I spoke when I gave my introduction to family theory, their basic insight is families work as systems. And for the most part, the early family therapists that you have heard about over the past couple of weeks were focused on helping people gain independence from the automatic nature of their system. And this is so no matter who you go through, all the early, for the most part, all of the early family therapists were focused on actually sort of, in a way it's funny, but separating people from their families. Not so much actually separating people from their families, but creating distance between the individual and the family's emotional process. Right? The basic understanding the basic theory that these early attachment therapists, or these early family therapists posited was that health will come along when people are independent, when they don't have to automatically follow the system of their family, both in the present construction of the family, and also intergenerationally, and as they move forward in their lives. So if we think about Bowen, right? Bowen is all about the person recognizing the patterns of their family, understanding the triangles, and understanding the emotional system, and being able to think through that, being able to mentalize that system so that they can gain independence from it. When they gain independence from it, then that will lead to all types of that will lead to all types of gains in mental health. Or if we think about Minuchin within families, Minuchin is helping families change the way that their system operates, right? Identify their system, identify the structure that enables that system, and then find other ways of operating so that they're not tied down to the system. Attachment theory and attachment family therapists look at this in the opposite way. While they recognize, attachment theorists don't reject the idea of a system, like some postmodern family therapies do. They'll recognize that a system exists. But what is important is not necessarily the independence from that system, but facilitating the good stuff, so to speak, that goes on inside of that system. What attachment family therapists are focused on is the establishment of family as a secure base. Right? And then that makes sense. From the perspective of attachment theory, when the family can exist as a secure base, then the functioning of all of its members will improve, and it will lead to positive longitudinal outcomes for the children. So what attachment theorists are less focused on identifying the specific nature of the system, and more concerned about finding what is going wrong in the interactions within that system that doesn't allow for security and doesn't allow for positive interactions. They're interested in how the internal working models of each member of the family coalesce and interact that in a way that triggers problems. What is it that people are assuming? What are their representations of themselves, and what are the representations of others that make them, that guide their behavior and their interactions in what will eventually cause problems. So I'm thinking about a case that I'm working with now, where you have a child who's sort of the internal working model is sort of just like right along the lines of what of how Bowlby expressed it, where it's very, very clear that this child has internalized the sense of I am not acceptable. And the question from an attachment perspective is what facilitates that process. Now it's a circular process. This is where the idea of circular causality of the system comes into play, because what happens? The child who has, if we start there in the circle, the child who has internalized a sense of I'm unacceptable assumes that his parents will be upset or annoyed or unhappy with him, and relates to them in a way that, in a defensive way, that where he doesn't need to feel the vulnerability of that state of being. So he causes problems in order to preempt the vulnerability of I am not acceptable. So he is in charge of not being acceptable, as opposed to his parents doing that. Now what happens then is the parents get exasperated, and they think, little Yankel is just a little terrorist, and we can't deal with him. And they relate to him in a way that conforms with that model in a way that is angry or upset or overly punitive, which does what? It confirms that model it confirms that internal working model. It confirms his sense of I am unacceptable. And so the question then, this becomes very, very pernicious. The question that attachment theorists ask themselves is how do we throw a wrench into that process? Because that process is a feedback loop that reinforces itself. And each time that process takes place, it reinforces the model that the parents have of the child and that the child has of themselves and of the parents. And it's not it's certainly not a simple thing. These models are very, very rigid. They're not easily changed. And so even if parents come in and say, he's really, really a great kid. There's something underlying that exasperation that has sort of guided the system up until that point is usually much more formidable and more formative than the thought process of he's really, really, he's a good kid. They sort of know that that's what they're supposed to say, but the sort of the lubrication in the system is like this child drives me up the wall, and the same thing for the child. Now, we're going to talk today. So, what I just gave you was a sort of a basic overview of attachment in family therapy. We're going to talk today about two models. We're going to talk today about EFT, emotionally focused couples therapy, and child-parent psychotherapy, CPP. I'm not going to be able to give full introductions to them, but I'm going to give sort of these basic introductions that, with an emphasis on how attachment theory informs both of these models. So let's start with EFT. EFT is guided by three components. The first is attachment theory. The second is systems theory. The third is experiential psychotherapy. Okay, let's start. How does attachment theory influence EFT? So the first assumption that EFT makes is that their attachment exists in adulthood, and that partners can act as attachment figures for each other. Each partner can be a secure base for the other. And problems develop when security in the relationship is undermined. Now, the models of attachment, the extent to which the couple can act as a secure base for each other, is influenced both by the interpersonal nature of the couple, what goes on between the two of them, and also the intrapsychic nature of each spouse. the internal working models that each spouse brings into the equation. And these are, you can't separate these from each other. They're mutually influential. Now, the other assumption based on attachment theory is that it's emotions that are at the core of the patterns that we see in couples. What EFT focuses on is, and as many couples therapies do, is the pursuer-distancer dynamic. Again, the pursuer-distancer, as I explained in my introduction, is where you have one spouse who pursues, who wants more engagement in the relationship. That creates anxiety in the other spouse, and the spouse, as a result of that pursuit, the spouse distances. That distancing makes the spouse number one more anxious, and the pursuit which amplifies the pursuit, and the second spouse feels more anxious and a greater need to distance. So you'll often usually classically it's the woman who is the pursuer and the male who is the distancer, although not always. And usually this will manifest in the wife saying something like, you spend so much time at work, you're never home and we can never have any time together. The husband, trying to engage but getting overwhelmed, and therefore spending more time at work in order to create more distance, which gets the wife more anxious, and she increases her criticism, which makes the husband increases the need for the husband to distance. That's sort of like a classic way of pursuing and distancing. Now, with classic family therapy looks at the behaviors there, not so much what goes on intrapsychically. What EFT proposes, it's the working models of emotion that guide that process. It is that in order to really deal with these feelings, we have to be able to tune in and tap into the emotional process, the underlying emotional process, and we'll see what that means behind that circular causality. And that moves us into systems theory. Again, systems theory, EFT borrows from systems theory the idea that a couple works as a system, that each person plays a role, that communication is constant. There's no such thing as not communicating. When I mentioned, I also mentioned this in the introduction, when a couple comes in or when a family comes in and says, we're not communicating, it means they are communicating and they're just communicating certain things. And that families are homeostatic entities that just repeat the process that they're in, that seek to form a status of equilibrium. Now, EFT is an experiential psychotherapy in the sense that change occurs in the room. EFT therapists are, if you watch an EFT therapist work, they are engaged. They're sitting up in their chair. They are encouraging the couple not to talk about, but to talk to. Right? The focus of the work is not on what happens at home, but is on what each spouse is feeling inside the room at any given moment. And the basic assumption here is that as couples can deepen their expression of emotion, that will change the interpersonal nature, that will change the working models that they bring into the relationship. So when emotion can be expressed in a genuine and authentic way, that is what will facilitate the process of security. EFT therapists are focused on the types of emotion that are displayed. And they identify 4 types of emotion. There are 3 that are actually really important. There's primary adaptive, primary maladaptive, secondary reactive, and instrumental. Now, the classic way of thinking about this is that secondary emotions are emotions that are, as the name implies, reactive emotions. They are reactive to a more fundamental emotion. The most basic understanding of the emotions that are usually associated as secondary are emotions like anger and frustration and feeling disgruntled. These are emotions that are thought of in EFT as secondary. Now, why are they secondary? They are reactions to more fundamental and basic feelings that the individual feels. The primary emotions like fear and vulnerability and insecurity, are emotion and sadness, are emotions that are very, very difficult to hold on to. Right? We feel very disempowered when we feel sad or when we feel scared. These are uncomfortable feelings that dysregulate us. Anger is a really good way, anger or frustration are really good ways of momentarily feeling empowered. Right? When I get angry, so even physiologically, right, blood rushes to my extremities, I feel stronger, my muscles feel more engaged. I don't feel that vulnerability that is associated with secondary emotions. What EFT proposes is that secondary emotions move people away from each other, while the expression of primary emotions is what generates intimacy. And for the very, very basic reason that primary emotions are easier to hear, and they are more authentic. They cut to the core of how people experience themselves. Right? If we go back to our attachment strategies, the insecure attachment strategies are essentially ways that secondary emotions are expressed. They are ways where our basic feelings when we don't feel the confidence to express those basic feelings, we use insecure attachment strategies to circumvent that fear. So the child who has no confidence that their mother is going to be responsive when they go for a reunion will mute their response. And something that I forgot to mention, which is selling here. So with a very, very interesting little factoid, when in the strange situation, in ensuing research, one of the things that they did was they hooked up the children to heart rate monitors and also tested for salivary cortisol. What they found with the dismissive child, what they found with the avoidant child, remember the avoidant child is the one who shows no emotion when the parents are, when upon reunion and upon departure. What they found is that despite the fact that there was no expression of emotion, when they hooked them up to the heart rate monitor and when they tested for salivary cortisol, their reactions were identical to the secure children. In other words, they felt the same level of fear. The underlying feelings were exactly the same, but the responses were muted. Because there was no confidence in the caregiver's ability to be responsive to the expressions of vulnerability, a strategy was developed where the responses were muted, despite the fact that at their core they felt the same level of fear. So again, moving it back into couples, secondary emotions are reactions to difficulties with primary emotions. And so the bread and butter of EFT is helping couples connect to those primary emotions. Now, the role of the therapist in EFT is, there are a number of roles of the therapist. The first is to be a process consultant. What does that mean? It's that the therapist is not necessarily a teacher, but what the therapist is attempting to do is to help the couple reprocess the way in which they interact with each other. The nature of the models that they use for the purposes of this relationship. And in order to do that, like I mentioned before when we talked about it, the experiential influence, is that they focus on the here and now. The here and now. We're going to have, in a minute or two, I'm going to show you a demonstration of the difference between some of the more classic models in EFT with some interesting actors, you'll see. But the basic idea here is the basic idea is that the therapist works in the moment, in the here and now. Now, in order to do that, the therapist needs to slow down the interactions. These interactions between couples take place very, very, very fast. And when one couple criticizes or blames, the other couple responds automatically. And in order for the therapist to help the clients access their more primary emotions, their first role is to create the security necessary to do this, and one piece of that is slowing down the interactions. Slowing down the interactions means that being actually very, very intrusive. I want you to stop here for a second. Let's examine what's happening right now. Now again, they're not saying let's understand what happened on Thursday afternoon. Let's understand what happened right now. As Mindy, you spoke to Yosef. What happened for you? What happened for you? Helping them deepen the experience in the here and now. Now, when the interactions are slowed down, the therapist can identify the positions that each partner takes, what the working models of the relationships are, and then help the clients think about the utility and the usefulness of those positions. And once that happens, they can help the clients understand their emotional underpinnings. So again, there's a multiple step process here. Number one, helping them slow down the interactions. Number two, helping the clients understand the process that they are in. And number three, and helping each spouse recognize the approach that they take to the other. And then, and this is the crucial step of EFT, helping each spouse understand the emotional underpinnings of their approach. What it is emotionally that makes them do the things that they do. Right? You feel scared, and therefore you ... You are feeling insecure, and therefore it makes sense that you said this, this, and this. And then in response, when Mindy said this, you felt that, you felt ... which made you react in this way. As people can move from the secondary emotional reactions to the more primary reactions, they can, number one, understand their own working models, and number two, they can then express those to their partner in a way that can be heard. And then finally, the role of the therapist is not just helping with understanding, but is choreographing new emotions, choreographing new interactions. Now that we've understood that you are feeling this, I want you to tell your spouse how you feel. So that moves from you are always nagging me to when you talk to me like that, I feel criticized and I feel completely incompetent. And that makes, when I feel completely incompetent, I feel the need to flee. That second way of relating creates a categorically new mode of interaction between the couple. Now, there's three tasks for the EFT therapist. The first is, again, as in almost all therapies, is the Therapeutic Alliance. Now, it's actually here the Therapeutic Alliance is of crucial importance because the therapy room has to be secure enough for the clients to take the risks that you are asking them to take. And this type of therapy requires the taking of massive risk. This is not an easy sort of laid-back type of therapy. This is a therapy where the clients are asked to access the parts of themselves that are the most vulnerable. In order to do that, there needs to be the Therapeutic Alliance needs to be strong and secure. And there's three parts of this. The couple has to, number one, feel bonded with the therapist. They feel just basically secure with who the therapist is. They have to view what's going on there is useful. They have to buy into this idea of, okay, we're going to access things that are deeper. They have to buy in that this is going to be helpful, because otherwise, why do it? Right? Again, it's dangerous and scary to do these types of things. So the Therapeutic Alliance goes beyond liking or feeling positively towards the therapist. It's feeling positively towards the process. And then finally, they have to agree that on the goals. This is where we want to get to. Right? We are going to take these risks because we have a mutual goal that makes sense to all of us. Secondly, as we've been speaking about, is accessing and reformulating emotions. So number one, the therapist identifies the circularity of the dance that the clients are in. Right? You do this, and then that makes you do this, and that makes you do this, and this is all circular. Once that's outlined, the therapist can work with each spouse to understand their own emotional experience. What did they do that promotes this dance? What do they do that facilitates this process? And then deepen that, right? What is going on emotionally that causes you to act the way that you act? And then as the underlying emotions are expressed and understood, that will expand the way that couples can interact with each other. Right? Couples interact within this dance, within this circular process. Couples have very, very limited ways of reacting to each other. When the emotions are accessed, that will expand the possibilities that are open to the child. And finally, restructuring interactions. So again, in EFT, it's not just enough to work on the level of understanding. The therapist encourages each spouse to express these the newfound understandings of their own emotions. So it's not just talking to the therapist about what it is that is going on, but it is also expressing that to their spouse and helping the spouse hear that in a way that is accepting and understanding. And so there is a constant interplay between these two tasks. Between number one, helping the client, helping the couple access underlying emotions, access primary feelings, and then helping the expression and the acceptance of those emotions. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at a couple of some demonstrations of this. I tried to get well-paid actors to be part of this. They weren't there, so I used my kids. So you'll see my 12 and 11-year-old kids talking about they never fight, but so a fight that I made up for them. And what I'm going to do is there's be 4 videos here. The first video is just a quick recognition of a quick illustration of the problem. Then we're going to look at it from the perspective of what a therapist who is more focused on communication how they would approach it. How a Bowen therapist who would take a more distant approach would focus on this, and then how an EFT therapist would go about this.
I can never bring friends home because whenever I do, I know that Shmuel is going to just be annoying and get in the way. He's just jealous that I have more friends than he does. I don't want your type of friends. They're all losers. All you do is spend time talking. It's so lame. So then why do you always cause problems if you have no interest? You're just jealous. You wish I was jealous. I have plenty of friends, but they don't just come over and spend all day doing nothing. Your friends come over and they lounge around. It takes up so much space. They are here for hours eating and talking, just getting in my way. You have no idea how annoying it is to have girls in a house all day while I am just trying to relax.
Okay, so here you have you have a couple coming in who is at each other's throats, right? They're in a stance of blaming. My daughter is saying, my son is saying, you have friends here all day and it gets in my way, and she's saying, it's really not, you're just jealous that you have no friends. Again, it's a couple coming in a state of mutual blame. They never fight about this. Okay, so what we're going to look at here is how a therapist working strictly on the basis of communication might approach this.
3. Okay. Atara, can you tell Shmuel clearly what it is that is bothering you? Please do so without blaming him or accusing him of anything. Just tell him what it is that upsets you.
I hate it when he...
No, speak to him. I hate it when you...
I hate it when you make fun of my friends when they come over to the house. They get embarrassed and it really bothers me when you do that.
Okay, Shmuel, in your own words, can you tell Tara what you just heard her say?
She said...
Tell her. You said...
What I heard you say was that you hate it when I make fun of your friends because they get embarrassed, and that really bothers you.
Okay, so here you have a basic active listening exercise. right? Where you have, and this is effective in the sense that it forces each client to move away from blame and to take a second to understand the concept of the others. Now, what you'll notice here is that the therapist is not trying to elicit deeper emotion, that it remains on the level of that they came in with. It just takes away, it's helping take away the blame. Speak about yourself, don't speak about the other person. So Atara at this point is not saying, you're just jealous, and Shmuel is not saying, your friends are lame. So, and this is helpful, but it doesn't deepen the experience at all. The next one we'll look at is Bo.
Atara, you raise a difficult dilemma. On one hand, you want friends over. On the other hand, Shmuel seems to get on their nerves each time they come over. What are your thoughts about managing this problem?
I think that Shmuel should stop. He's being such a jerk.
Yeah, I bet that would be ideal. But given that you can't control whether he stops or not, how would you like to manage the situation? What are ways that you can go about dealing with this problem you have?
I guess that we could all hang out at someone else's house.
Would that be an adequate solution?
I guess, but it's really unfair that Shmuel gets to pick me out.
Yeah, I can see your point.
Okay, here you have a Bowen therapy in the sense that each client is encouraged to look at self. And so when I work with Atara here, I'm not saying, what do you want from Shmuel? I'm saying, you have a dilemma, right? And what position are you going to take coming from a place of self that will address that dilemma? And if I work with, when working with Shmuel, I would do the same thing. So here, this is completely non-experiential in the sense that I'm helping that. There's nothing going on there's nothing happening about what's going on in the room. And I'm helping each person think more clearly about themselves and define positions of self that don't have to necessarily do with the interaction. And finally, here's a demonstration of a short EFT clip.
So it seems like what happens is that Shmuel gets annoyed that Atara is having friends again, and so you bother her, which makes you, Atara, want to spend less time with the family and more time with friends, which gets Shmuel even more upset, which makes Atara want to get away even more, and on and on and on. Would you say that this is a good way of understanding the dance that the two of you are engaged in?
Yeah, so if you would just lay off and not bother me so much, I wouldn't need to spend so much time with friends. I don't care if you spend time with friends, just don't do it at home.
I wonder about that, Shmuel. You mentioned that you and Atara used to be very close. Can it be that you don't care about your relationship with her?
Maybe I care a little, but it wouldn't be a big deal if she just didn't bring friends home.
Yeah, it makes sense that you would care a little bit about your relationship with her, given how close you were. How does it make you feel seeing that she's moving away?
It's annoying. It's like she doesn't care about the family anymore.
I imagine it might be scary to see her disconnect from you and the family.
Okay, so here now, what you'll see here is the therapist is, number one, articulates the dance. So again, this was like a few sessions of therapy in a minute. But the therapist articulates the dance, and the clients respond to that understandably with blame. And instead of engaging the blame, moving towards one spouse, here I chose my son, and deepening his experience. And so when I say, so he says, yeah, if she wouldn't bring friends home, it wouldn't be a big deal. And so I'm moving towards okay, what is it that bothers you? And here the therapist, the EFT therapist, will make suggestions and small interpretations that move the client past the basic stance of blame to the more vulnerable feelings that they themselves feel, and ultimately moving Shmuel towards talking about how much he misses the relationship that he has with his sister. That it is scary to lose that relationship as she gets more connected with friends. This is what distinguishes EFT from other therapies, in the sense that the EFT therapist is constantly trying to move the conversations deeper to access those primary emotions. Okay, we're going to get into, so I'll take some questions about EFT.
I can see there being a problem with their sequence. For example, if there's infidelity going on, or close. What would you do in a situation like that? Would you meet that individual?
Yeah. So the question is about safety in cases like infidelity or sexual abuse. So EFT, Sue Johnson, who is the founder of one of the founders of EFT, talks about counterindications of EFT. One of them is when abuse is going on. Because
For the abuse, let's say that a wife or a husband want, like,
abuse in the past.
Exactly.
Okay, so EFT therapists will usually meet individually with clients, with spouses at the outset. Have one or two where these things can be discussed, where the therapist can engage with each client, with each spouse. What sort of are there things that you feel just sort of go beyond the bounds of what can be spoken about here? This goes to a larger question that exists in family therapy about what to do with secrets, and each therapist has sort of their own it needs to develop a way of dealing with secrets, and how to manage holding a secret in a couples therapy. That's another presentation in and of itself of dealing with secrets in family therapy. But again, to address your basic question, if the therapist suspects that there are issues that sort of go beyond the pale of what is secure, that those don't necessarily need to be addressed. Not everything needs to be addressed in a couples therapy. What needs to be addressed is moving the basic interactional patterns to a deeper level so that they can be expanded. And again, the fundamental piece here is that each spouse needs to feel the safety to do that, and they need to feel like if there's something that they can't speak about, that the therapist will respect that. It doesn't mean that the therapist might take a position of, I think this is something we should work towards, but the therapist will never say this is something that needs to be dealt with. Any other questions about EFT?
I'm wondering if you had a waiver signed by the actors.
to have waiver signed by the actors? No, I think legally, because they're under 18 and they're my kids, but they were very interested in how this would go over. They wanted reports right when I get home tonight. So I'll tell them I'll tell them that they did a good job.
I also like the body language.
You like the body language of, yeah, so my daughter, when I asked her to do this, she took a drama club last year. So she said, can I act? So I said, sure, you can act. Okay, so, the next model that we're going to talk about is child-parent psychotherapy. And we're going to have to talk about it quickly. Child-parent psychotherapy was a model developed by Alicia Lieberman and Patricia Van Horn in San Francisco. And it is designed to address severe trauma with young children. They work with ages 0 to 5, but this model can be adapted. It has been adapted for later ages as well. And the focus that Alicia and Patricia have, the focus that they take, is on how trauma influences and interrupts attachment patterns, and how those interruptions in attachment patterns based on traumatic experiences create problems in family life. Now, this is not necessarily a family theory in the sense that they are not family theorists; they're attachment theorists. And to be quite honest, because they work mostly with an inner city population, and so their model is developed around single-parent households. But this has wide application to family and family theory as well. So the first thing we need to talk about is understanding the impact of trauma on the attachment system and how it impacts relationships. So the first thing that trauma does is that it impacts the basic trust that children have in their caregivers. When overwhelming trauma where there is significant danger, where the danger is of a existential nature, even if it's not literally of an existential nature, but when it feels that way, when the fear is overwhelming, it creates the internalization of the message of I can't trust anybody to protect me, right? So when there is a severe trauma, what has happened is that the assumption of security that is placed in the attachment relationship, when I go back to my caregiver, I will be safe, that has been breached. Very often not of the fault, not due to any fault of the caregiver themselves, but l'maaseh, that basic implicit trust has been breached. Now, when the parent themselves has been the one who is maltreating the child, when they are the source of the trauma, that becomes even more pernicious. Because, like we saw in Disorganized Attachment, it is the person who is in charge of the child's protection that is now the source of the fear. The second piece the second thing that we need to take into account is traumatic expectations, right? And that has to do with the assumption. If we think here about the internal working model, that the world is not going to treat us well. The world is inherently a dangerous place. Right, now what that's going to do is engender feelings of helplessness, of hopelessness. There's nothing that I can do. And it will inform the way that children relate to their surroundings. Now, one really important phenomena that CPP therapists think about is identification with the aggressor. Identification with the aggressor is a phenomena that was first identified by Anna Freud, and explains the oppositional nature that we find in a lot of maltreated children. Basically, the way the theory goes is that when a child or somebody has been the recipient of maltreatment, when they have been the victim of aggression, so that engenders feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. In the future, when they encounter those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, instead of just submitting to those feelings, the more the more sort of conducive, I'm looking for the correct word, the more adaptive response in that moment is to become the aggressor. It feels better to be the aggressor, right? There's an identification with the person that took advantage of them early on, and when they feel those same helpless and hopeless feelings, instead of just submitting to them, they take the position of the aggressor so that they can now be the ones in control. So these traumatic expectations often create a preemptive identification with the aggressor. Instead of allowing myself to be the victim and allow myself these feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, I will become aggressive in order to prevent that. So when you find children who are very oppositional, very often this is a response of, this is a means of being in control. I'm going to be the one I'm going to preempt any possibility that I'm going to feel those vulnerable feelings by creating opposition and aggression and difficulty to start with. I'm going to be the one in control of this process. Now what ends up happening there is that the attachment becomes organized around these expressions of anger and rage. This is what bonds the only connection that takes place is these oppositional ones. So actually what ends up happening is that when people are not fighting, they feel disconnected from each other. Because the only way they know of being together is through conflict. Now the third relational aspect is one of the things that we know about trauma is that there are trauma reminders. There are stimuli from the environment that trigger those feelings that accompanied the trauma, and they're often very, very difficult to predict. And they're often not easily, and as a result, they're often not easily explained. And so you might have a child who just responds very intensively in a way that we can't really, where the parent doesn't really understand. Now that's going to elicit a response pattern in the parent. When the parent can't make sense, why is little Johnny going crazy here? That usually is not going to engender feelings of support, but rather it's going to trigger feelings of exasperation, which again moves into the way that permeates and that gets infused into just the nature of the attachment relationship, how parent and child react to each other. Now, when the trauma was organized around the family, members of the family can be trauma reminders for each other. So the child can be a trauma reminder for a parent. So for example, I was working with a family who there was a severe history of abuse from the father who was now out of the house. But the mother when the father would get violent, the mother would just like cower in fear and try to like make herself as small as possible. Now, what would happen is that this would also happen when the mother was feeling, even after the father had left, when the mother was feeling sort of overwhelmed or helpless, she would also have that same response. And what that did is, what became clear to us as the therapy progressed, is that the child was responding to that, and that was a trigger for the child that engendered in him the memories of the trauma. And what would happen? So typically the pattern there would be that the mother would just like sink inside of herself. The child would go nuts, and then the mother would respond with some form of aggression. It was crucial to understand what was going on for the child in that moment when the mother cowered in fear, and to be able to put those into words. The trauma will, even when the trauma has happened to the child, it will often elicit a feeling of helplessness in the parents. Because as parents, our understandings of ourselves are so focused around being a protective force for our children, we often have feelings of, it often engenders feelings of just overwhelming helplessness when our child has been traumatized. And helping, and that speaks to the need to help parents regulate themselves. And the final piece here is a compromised ability to assess danger. So this is one of the sort of most traumatic experiences that I ever had. When I was working as a social worker, I went into I did a home visit, and this was also a case where the father had left the home. He was very, very violent. The mother I was sitting with the mother. The father came in and just created this like massive, just like he started yelling and throwing things, and there was like a 2-minute period, and then he left. And I was afraid. I didn't know what I was sort of frozen in fear. But after I left, the mother said, he has such a good relationship with our son. He's so supportive. He's so supportive with our son. And I'm thinking there, like, did you just not see what I saw? And what was essentially happening was that this mother was such a traumatized woman that her ability to assess danger, her ability to recognize that this father, while it's possible he, in his happier moments, he was very supportive and good with the child, like that, him throwing things and yelling and creating this ruckus was actually dangerous for the child. Her ability to assess that danger was compromised. You'll often find this with mothers who have not always, mothers with a severe history of sexual abuse. You'll see on one hand, they'll be hypervigilant and overprotective with their children, and on the other hand, there are times where like their supervision just lapses completely, and they're like there's these brief moments where they'll let their children like go unsupervised in a way that is sort of really blatant and dangerous. But again, this is because what ongoing trauma does is it compromises our ability to assess, like, wait a minute, what actually is dangerous here? Well, I see we're running out of time. I was partially successful in squeezing 6 hours into 2. The model of Ghost in the Nursery was initially proposed by Selma Freyberg, where she recognized a three-step process. First, where parents who have undergone severe trauma in childhood typically or very often repress the associated feelings. They repress the helplessness and terror that accompany trauma. The child, as children do, children make us feel helpless, right? And, even the best, even like the children who are most well behaved, we have our moments of helplessness and I have no idea what I'm going to do here. That's sort of like a basic feeling of being a parent. But the meaning of that feeling for these parents is overwhelming. It serves as a trauma reminder for what they experienced before, and then they respond with identification with the aggressor. What Freiberg recognized, I'm sorry I'm rushing through this, what Freiberg recognized is that when she was able to help parents connect with the emotions of early trauma, that third process of identification with the aggressor didn't need to take place. Parents were able to regulate those feelings regulate the feelings of helplessness and terror, and recognize that they were moving back into these trauma memories. Okay, so quickly we're going to talk about what the CPP therapist does. The first is establishment of safety. You can't have a secure base when there's actual physical when physical safety is compromised. And so the CPP therapist, when there is actual danger going on, works very, very concretely to see if there are ways that violence can be minimized. If that's working with the system, if that's helping the parents take measures to ensure safety in their home. The second step is promoting reciprocity. This is really where we see attachment. In order for the bond to be created, there needs to be a basic joy in interaction. I'm not going to get to the end of this. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to run through these. The fourth is affect regulation, helping parents regulate their own affect in order to be that secure base for their child. The fourth is normalizing the traumatic response, is being able to connect the response of the child, the response of the parents to the experiences that they have undergone. And the fifth is being able to trust their bodies again. In recent years, we've seen that there's been lots and lots of research on somatic interventions with trauma and the importance of those, and there's room for that in CPP as well. I'm seeing that we are out of time. Hopefully we'll have another opportunity to talk about child-parent psychotherapy and its connections to attachment. There are opportunities there are actually, CPP is a method is an approach that is growing in Israel. There are opportunities through Machon Faruv. There are opportunities to learn CPP for those that are interested. Okay, Dr. Milevsky, I understand that there is a meeting that needs to go on now. Okay, thank you.